Welcome to The Debate. We typically expect journalism to act like a perfectly transparent window pane. You look through it and you see the world exactly as it is, entirely uncolored by the glass itself.
Right, it's the fundamental promise of neutrality. We want the facts stripped of all that personal baggage.
Exactly. That transparency, that absence of the reporter's own shadow, is supposed to be the gold standard of reporting. We find a lot of comfort in the idea that the news is just a mechanical reflection of reality.
If the journalist is doing their job right, they shouldn't exist in the story at all.
But what if that perfectly clear window systematically leaves out the most crucial context? Or, what if the frame itself is built to distort the picture? Today, we are looking at someone who actively shatters that window.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating approach.
We're diving into a paper by Sawsan Malla Hussein called Graphic Occupation, Joe Sacco and the Artwork of Bearing Witness. Sacco is a journalist who documents mass violence, but he does it through comics, and he explicitly draws himself and all his own biases right into the panels.
It's a radical departure from what we consider traditional reporting. And the core conflict we are exploring today is whether Sacco's approach, this highly subjective artistic intervention, can actually help build real-world peace, or if it simply replaces factual news with emotional manipulation.
I'll be taking the position that Sacco's intentional subjectivity is actually far more honest than mainstream journalism. By using the graphic medium, he completely dismantles the myth of the invisible reporter. And I'll argue that this method is an absolutely vital mechanism for achieving what peace scholars call positive peace.
And I will be pushing back on that, because while Sacco's art is undeniably powerful, I question the practical reality of it. It's a massive leap to suggest that reading a highly curated subjective comic book translates into the actual dismantling of entrenched geopolitical structures.
It is a leap, but a necessary one, I think.
Well, I'd also argue that when you start hand-drawing real-world trauma, you introduce some profound ethical risks regarding how we consume the suffering of others.
To really understand Sacco's work, we have to start with this concept of positive peace. It was coined by the sociologist Johann Galtung. For the listener, when we normally think of peace, we are usually thinking of what Galtung calls negative peace.
Right, which just means the guns have stopped firing.
Exactly. There is an absence of active, direct violence. But positive peace is much deeper. It requires dismantling the structural inequality, the systemic oppression, and the cultural narratives that keep a conflict going even when no one is actively shooting.
So positive peace is essentially fixing the plumbing of this society, not just turning off a leaking faucet.
That's a great way to put it. And you cannot build positive peace if your journalism only selectively reports on the leaking faucet. Mainstream conflict reporting often, parachutes in, films the rubble, and leaves.
It treats violence as a sudden, episodic outburst.
Yes. And this is where Sacco's self-reflexive comics journalism acts as a counter-archive. And by counter-archive, I mean he is creating a permanent physical record of the people and the structural realities that the 24-hour news cycle completely forgets about the next morning.
Because he's staying there, immersing himself.
Right.
In works like Palestine, Footnotes in Gaza, and War on Gaza, Sacco completely abandons the pretense of the invisible reporter. He draws himself into the scenes, famously depicting himself wearing these blank, opaque glasses.
Which is a very deliberate visual choice. He never shows his eyes.
Right, never. The blank glasses act as a constant visual reminder to the reader, you are looking at this through my mediation. I am processing this. By openly acknowledging his bias, he forces the reader to engage critically.
Okay, but how does that lead to peace?
It fosters what John Paul Lederach calls moral imagination, the creative capacity to envision a shared human reality. And that imagination is the required first step for any real conflict transformation. Look, the theoretical framework is beautiful. The idea of fostering moral imagination sounds incredibly appealing. But my skepticism kicks in when we try to map that artistic theory onto the brutal reality of geopolitical conflict.
Why is that?
Because if we abandon objectivity for intentional subjectivity, we are walking onto very thin ice. Yes, comics can elicit deep empathy, but what happens when we rely on a medium that is, by definition, highly curated and emotionally engineered?
You think it's manipulative?
My concern is that doing so just creates an emotional echo chamber.
But doesn't traditional journalism already operate in an echo chamber? It just hides behind the aesthetic of neutrality.
It does have its flaws, absolutely, but it still strives for a baseline of verifiable reality. If we accept that truth in reporting should be relational and subjective driven by an artist's personal emotional response, we lose the very grounding required to hold institutional power accountable.
I'm not sure we lose the grounding at all.
Well, you are trading a flawed objective standard for a system where whoever draws the most emotionally compelling picture wins the narrative. That doesn't dismantle the entrenched mechanisms of military conflict described in the source material. It just, moves the battleground to aesthetics.
Let's look at how Sacco actually handles that baseline of verifiable reality versus the illusion of objectivity. There's a brilliant moment the source material highlights from the opening pages of Footnotes in Gaza.
Oh, the restaurant scene?
Yes, Sacco is in Jerusalem, and a friend from Reuters brings him to a restaurant where all the foreign correspondents hang out. Sacco draws these journalists drinking, dusting themselves off after a day in the field, and basically talking the cynical talk of the seasoned hack.
Right, they are actively joking about how entirely interchangeable their stories are.
Exactly. They are operating on autopilot. So what does Sacco do visually? He literally merges the image of the restaurant's printed menu card with images of horrific bus bombings in Israel and military incursions in Palestine.
It's a very striking visual.
It is. The text of the menu overlays the carnage. Now, a traditional objective reporter would never do that. But Sacco's curated subjectivity, forcing your eye to jump from a list of appetizers to a blown-up bus, forces the reader out of their desensitized consumption.
I'll admit it's effective.
It exposes how routinized objective reporting flattens the specificity of human suffering and actually normalizes the violence.
I agree that shaking a reader out of their numbness is valuable. But let's analyze the mechanism of what Sacco is doing there. I come at it from a different way. When he overlaps a restaurant menu with a bombing, he is making a profound, aggressive editorial choice.
He is.
He is directing the reader precisely on how to feel about those journalists and the conflict. If I can offer an analogy, his method is essentially a visual op-ed masquerading as a documentary.
I wouldn't say masquerading. I mean, he's very upfront about it.
Upfront, yes, but the end result is still a manipulated emotional state. Now, op-eds have tremendous value in our media diet. But if Sacco actively curates the reader's emotional response through highly stylized artistic juxtapositions, how do we distinguish between historical truth and emotional manipulation?
Because the truth is in the context.
Let's flip the politics for a second. If a journalist whose worldview you fundamentally oppose uses these exact same subjective, emotionally manipulative techniques to justify a state's military violence, you have no objective grounding left to challenge them.
That's a slippery slope argument.
Is it? You can't say your facts are wrong, because the standard is no longer facts, it's subjective interpretation. If everyone abandons the pursuit of a clear window pane, holding power accountable doesn't get easier, it just dissolves into competing emotional manipulations.
You are equating subjectivity with a lack of factual rigor, which is a total misunderstanding of Sacco's process. The subjectivity is in the presentation, not the research.
But the presentation frames everything.
True, but Sacco spends years conducting exhaustive investigative journalism. He cross-references interviews, he digs through municipal archives, he roots his drawings in actual historical photographs and UN reports. The subjectivity isn't a license to invent facts, it's a tool to contextualize them.
But the context is entirely his own.
Because context always requires interpretation. Look, you can report an objective fact, say a bus attack or border clash, but if you report that perfectly verified fact entirely in isolation, devoid of the 50 years of structural violence that led up to it, you are giving the reader a profoundly inaccurate impression of reality.
So you're saying objectivity itself is a manipulation?
Yes. That so-called objective reporting is the manipulation because it implies the event happened in a vacuum. Sacco's blank glasses are a feature, not a bug. They constantly tell the reader, I am interpreting this history. Do not consume this passively.
It is more transparent about its framing, I'll grant you that.
That self-reflexivity is vastly more honest than a corporate news anchor staring into a camera and claiming the voice of God.
Okay, but transparency of framing does not inherently resolve the ethical issues of the content itself. If you're listening right now, you might be thinking, wait, a comic book about a massacre? Isn't that inherently disrespectful?
People definitely have that reaction at first.
Right, we are talking about horrific, real-world mass violence. When an artist takes it upon themselves to hand-draw the actual physical suffering of real people, the ethical tightrope becomes incredibly thin.
It is a tightrope, but I'd argue the comics medium is uniquely equipped to walk it ethically, precisely because it can humanize victims who are usually relegated to mere statistics in a textbook.
How so?
Let's talk about the schoolyard screening scene in Footnotes in Gaza. Sacco is documenting the 1956 massacres in Rafah, where Israeli forces gathered Palestinian men in a schoolyard for an agonizing 8 to 10 hour screening process.
Which involves severe beatings and executions.
Yes, and mainstream history largely treated this as a footnote.
Which is literally where he gets the title of the book.
Exactly. And how does he present this footnote? The source material emphasizes a specific visual layout, a borderless splash page. Sacco painstakingly individualizes the faces of dozens of Palestinian men sitting on the ground.
He's not just doing a generic crowd scene.
No, he isn't. He draws the specific terror in an elderly man's eyes, the cringing anticipation in the shoulders of the man behind him. He doesn't just give us the statistic of the dead, he gives us their faces. And critically, Sacco maintains a rigorous, unvarnished honesty.
He definitely leaves the rough edges in.
He does. He refuses to create perfect, idealized victims to make the story easier to digest. He shows Palestinian teenagers aggressively harassing him for money in the street.
And he depicts the Fatih fighters as well.
Right. He draws an aged Fatih commander casually recounting how his unit killed Israeli soldiers and severed their ears as proof. He even draws close-ups of lifeless Israeli children from the historical attacks.
So he shows everything.
By refusing to sanitize the reality, by showing all the ugly, contradictory human elements, Sacco avoids cheap emotional manipulation and achieves a deeply profound form of witnessing.
The commitment to showing the unvarnished reality is commendable. But we have to talk about the inherent aestheticization of violence that this medium demands.
I don't think it necessarily aestheticizes it.
Come on, no matter how honest Sacco is trying to be, he is still creating a stylized, heavily inked rendering of profound human agony. Let's look at the sequence in War on Gaza depicting the 2018 Great March of Return.
Ah, the sniper sequence.
Exactly. The paper details this highly specific layout. The lower section of the page is composed entirely of fragmented, repeated frames. And inside those frames are just lower limbs, legs and knees, viewed directly through the crosshairs of a sniper rifle.
It's a harrowing sequence.
Sacco is referencing an Amnesty International report about snipers intentionally inflicting life-changing amputations. But look at what the art is doing. By visually severing these limbs from the human beings they belong to and mechanically repeating them in graphic target scopes across the page.
He's showing the mechanics of it.
But we have to ask a hard question. Does reducing real victims to mechanized, repeated design elements prompt ethical witnessing, or does it cross the line into turning trauma into a visual spectacle?
I really don't think it's a spectacle.
When you stylize an amputation into a striking graphic layout, you whisk the reader marveling at the brilliant artistry rather than actually engaging with the atrocity.
I completely disagree with that reading of the layout, because the fragmentation in those panels is exactly the point. The visual layout isn't aestheticizing the violence to make it, cool or visually pleasing.
Then what is it doing?
It is using the mechanics of the comic medium to illustrate the systemic nature of the violence itself. Think about how reading a comic works. Your eye is forced to jump from box to box to box.
Right, it's a very controlled reading experience.
Exactly. Sacco traps the reader's eye in that repetition. The repetition of the body parts framed as targets forces the reader to experience how the victims were depersonalized by the snipers.
So he is visually mimicking the mindset of the shooter.
Precisely. It visually recreates the clinical, calculated rhythm of destruction. This ties directly back to what we discussed about positive peace.
Remind me how.
Well, A mainstream article might just print the sentence, X number of people suffered leg injuries. You read that in 1 second and move on. Sacco's layout physically slows your eye down and forces you to experience the systematic, repetitive nature of the targeting.
It makes you sit with it.
Yes, he is taking Galting's concept of structural violence and making it visible, showing how the violence isn't a chaotic fog of war accident, but an entrenched, operationalized system. The rigidity of standard reported simply cannot convey the mechanized dehumanization of that event.
I will concede that as a piece of visual communication, it brilliantly illustrates the mechanism of the violence. But our debate today is whether this artistic intervention can actually drive positive peace.
And I believe it can.
And this is where the entire premise stumbles for me. Does seeing a brilliant visual representation of structural violence actually do anything to dismantle the structure?
Yes, because it forces a reckoning with complicity. You cannot dismantle a system of violence if the public funding it is allowed to remain comfortably detached.
What do you mean by public funding?
In War on Gaza, Sacco doesn't just implicate the snipers on the border. He implicates himself, and by extension, his Western readers. There is a surreal metaphorical sequence where he visually processes his own U.S. tax payments, drawing them transforming into the tanks, drones, and bombs used by the military.
Oh, the sequence where the money literally drops into the machinery of war?
Right. This visual self-indictment completely shatters the illusion of distant spectatorship. He makes the interdependencies visible. He draws black bombs falling into white-shrouded corpses and sarcastically proposes using the term genocidal self-defense just to satisfy the endless pedantic Western debates over language.
He's certainly not mincing words.
He is stripping away the euphemisms that allow structural violence to persist. He demands the exact kind of accountability, financial, linguistic, and moral, that is necessary to even begin building positive peace.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the mechanism of action from a reader in New York feels implicated about their taxes to geopolitical structures in the Middle East are dismantled is fundamentally broken?
I don't think it's broken. It's just a first step.
And the tragic irony is that Sacco's own work proves it's broken. The source material highlights a devastatingly self-aware moment in War on Gaza. Sacco revisits a past conversation with a Gazan friend.
I know the moment you're talking about.
Years prior, Sacco, speaking from his position of comfortable Western privilege, suggested that the Palestinians should march peacefully to the barrier, like Gandhi.
Right, the classic liberal peace-building prescription.
Exactly. He genuinely believed that if they just performed perfect nonviolence, the international community would laud them and the oppressors would be shamed into peace.
And his friend's response?
His friend looked at him and said, very simply, "They will shoot us." And then years later, the Great March of Return actually happened. Tens of thousands marched, and they were shot down in droves.
It's a heartbreaking realization.
Sacco's inclusion of this anecdote illustrates the catastrophic failure of idealistic Western peace-building theories. He realizes his moral posturing was entirely useless.
But that's exactly why he includes it.
If the actual physical embodiment of peaceful protest is met with sniper fire, how can we realistically argue that a comic book, no matter how brilliantly it implicates a reader's tax dollars, will dismantle entrenched military power?
It won't do it alone.
The art documents the tragedy beautifully, but it demonstrates the absolute, devastating limits of moral imagination against the live bullet.
That is a very powerful point, but I think you are misinterpreting why Sacco includes the Gandhi anecdote. It isn't an admission that art is useless.
Then what is it?
It is a critique of a very specific, sanitized type of peace building that completely ignores structural violence. He is mocking his own former belief that simply performing nonviolence is enough, when the opposing structure operates with absolute impunity.
So he's admitting his own naivete.
Exactly. Sacco isn't saying art stops bullets. He is using his comics to attack the impunity at its root, which brings us to the third part of Galting's theory, cultural violence.
Remind the listener how that connects to the structural violence.
So Galting outlines a triad. Direct violence is the physical strike, the bullet. Structural violence is the systemic inequality, the blockade, the unequal laws.
And cultural violence?
Cultural violence is the narrative that makes the first two seem normal, inevitable, or justified.
The media coverage, the euphemisms, the language of balanced conflict that justifies disproportionate force, that is cultural violence.
I see.
Sacco's work targets that cultural pillar. By shifting the reader from detached, objective consumption to participatory, uncomfortable accountability, he begins to erode the ideological support that military power relies on.
It's a war of narratives.
Right. A comic book doesn't stop a bullet in mid-air, but a comic book challenges the cultural narrative that paid for the bullet, shipped the bullet, and justified firing it.
I recognize the ambition of targeting that cultural pillar. It's a noble goal, honestly. But I maintain a rigorous skepticism about the efficacy of that targeting in the face of modern geopolitical machinery.
Because of the scale of the media?
Because we are living in an era of unprecedented media saturation. While Sacco's work is a profound counter-archive, it exists within a highly fragmented landscape where emotional resonance is constantly weaponized to polarize rather than to build peace.
That's a fair concern.
My concern remains that while Sacco deeply affects the individual reader, sparking that moral awakening you mentioned, the translation of that personal awakening into the cessation of a decades-long conflict is incredibly tenuous.
It is a long road, yes.
We have to be very careful not to conflate the aesthetic triumph of bearing witness with the political triumph of conflict transformation. Documenting the footnote of history beautifully does not automatically rewrite the main text of reality.
Well, to summarize my position, in light of where we've landed, I think Sacco's graphic journalism exposes the fatal limitations of detached, so-called objective reporting.
It certainly exposes its blind spots.
Yeah. By embracing intentional subjectivity, placing himself in the frame, and painstakingly humanizing the victims of violence, he creates a vital counter-narrative. He uses the unique mechanisms of the comic medium to visualize structural violence, shatter the euphemisms of war, and force audiences to reckon with their own material complicity.
The implication of the reader is undeniable.
And while art may not instantly dismantle military structures, this cultivation of moral imagination and accountability is the indispensable prerequisite for any genuine pursuit of positive peace.
And to summarize my stance, I hold immense respect for Sacco's dedication to documenting erased traumas. He has created a masterful historical archive.
We definitely agree on that.
However, we must remain critically aware of the risks of abandoning objectivity. Relying on curated emotional manipulation, even for a righteous cause, is a dangerous precedent. Furthermore, while the comics medium possesses an incredible power to visualize the mechanisms of violence, we cannot confuse subjective artistic resonance with the practical reality of geopolitical change.
The limits of art.
Exactly. Art can powerfully document the failure of peace, but we must be deeply realistic about its limitations in enforcing it.
Well, I think we certainly share a convergence on the incredible power of this medium. Comics can manipulate time, space, and perspective to visualize the human cost of conflict in ways that traditional media simply cannot even attempt.
Absolutely. It offers a unique, profound tool for historical excavation. The tension just remains regarding the political efficacy of that tool out in the real world.
Indeed. This discussion really reflects the value of interrogating not just the news, but how we consume it and how we allow history to be written. The source material offers even deeper explorations into the intersections of visual culture, memory, and international law for those who want to look further.
It forces every reader to ask who is holding the camera and what they are actively choosing to leave out of the frame.
Exactly. It brings us right back to that window pane we started with. Perhaps we need to stop pretending the glass is perfectly clear and start examining the smudges, the tint, and the hands that installed it in the first place. Thank you for joining us.